Hi, friends. Hi, friends. It's Wednesday today, and we're going to read chapters 18 to 20. So we're going to a ball. um, I hope you're all having a good day. Um, and yeah, I'm going to start reading if you're ready. Don't know if anyone's actually here. We got no thing doesn't register anyone being actually here, but oh well. Maybe the folks will arrive in time. Uh, Maybe we'll give it another little bit. I love talking to myself. So far in the story, we have met the Bennets, we have met the Bingleys, we have met Darcy, we have met Collins, we have met Wickham. um, and Elizabeth putting a lot of trust in appearances, rather likes Wickham. Uh, and No one likes Mr. Collins except except Mrs. Bennet. Ah, hello, Jules. There you are. Um, so, if we are all sitting comfortably, time for a ball. Till Elizabeth, till Elizabeth entered the drawing room at Netherfield and looked in vain for Mr. Wickham among the cluster of redcoats there assembled. A doubt of him being present had never occurred to her. The certainty of meeting him had not been checked by any of those recollections that might not unreasonably have alarmed her. She had dressed with more than the usual care, and prepared in the highest spirits for the conquest of all that remained unsubdued of his heart, trusting that it was not more than one might be won in the course of the evening. But in an instant arose the dreadful suspicion of his being purposely omitted for Mr. Darcy's pleasure in the Bingleys' invitation to the officers. And though this was not exactly the case, the absolute fact of his absence was pronounced by his friend Mr. Denny, to whom Lydia eagerly applied, and who told him that Wickham had been obliged to go to town on business that day, and was not yet returned, adding with a significant smile, "I do not imagine his business would have called him away just now, had he not wished to avoid a certain gentleman here." This part of his intelligence, though unheard by Lydia, was caught by Elizabeth, and as it assured her that Darcy was not less answerable for Wickham's absence than if her first surmise had been just, every feeling of displeasure against the former was so sharpened by immediate disappointment that she could hardly reply with tolerable civility to the polite inquiries which he directly afterwards approached to make. Attention's forbearance, patience with Darcy, was injury to Wickham. She resolved against any sort of conversation with him, and turned away with a degree of ill humour which she could not wholly surmount even in speaking to Mr. Bingley, whose blind partiality provoked her. But Elizabeth was not formed for ill humour, and though every prospect of her own was destroyed for the evening, it could not dwell long on her spirits. Having told all of her griefs to Charlotte Lucas, whom she had not seen for a week, she was soon able to make voluntary transition to the oddities of her cousin, and to point him out to her particular notice. The first two dances, however, brought a return of distress. They were dances of mortification. Mr. Collins, awkward and solemn, apologizing instead of attending, and often moving wrong without being aware of it, gave her all the shame and misery which a disagreeable partner for the last couple of dances can give. The moment of her release from him was ecstasy. She danced next with an officer, and had the refreshment of talking of Mr. Wickham, and of hearing that he was universally liked. When those dances were over, she returned to Charlotte Lucas, and was in conversation with her, when she found herself suddenly addressed by Mr. Darcy, who took her so much by surprise in his application for her hand that, without knowing what she did, she accepted him. He walked away again immediately, and she was left to fret over her own want of presence of mind. Charlotte tried to console her. "I dare say you will find him very agreeable." "Heaven forbid! That would be the greatest misfortune of all, to find a man agreeable whom one is determined to hate. Wish me not such evil." When the dance recommenced, however, and Darcy approached to claim her hand, Charlotte could not help cautioning her in a whisper not to be a simpleton and allow her fancy for Wickham to make her appear unpleasant in the eyes of a man of 10 times his consequence. Elizabeth made no answer, and took her place in the set, amazed at the dignity to which she was arriving in being allowed to stand opposite to Mr. Darcy, and reading in her neighbours' looks their equal amazement in beholding it. They stood for some time without speaking a word, and she began to imagine that their silence was to last through the 2 dances, and at first was resolved not to break it, till suddenly fancying that it would be the greater punishment to her partner to oblige him to talk, and she made some slight observation on the dance. He replied, and was again silent. After a pause of some minutes, she addressed him a second time with, "It's your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I asked about the dance, and you ought to make some kind of remark on the size of the room or the number of couples." He smiled and assured her that whatever she wished him to say should be said. "Very well, that reply will do for the present. Perhaps by and by I may observe that the private balls are much pleasanter than the public ones. But now we may be silent." "Do you talk by rule, then, while you are dancing?" "Sometimes. One might speak a little, you know. It would... sorry. It would look odd to be entirely silent for an hour and a half. And yet, for the advantage of some, conversation ought to be arranged so that they may have the trouble of saying as little as possible." "And you consult your own feelings in the present case, or do you imagine that you are gratifying mine?" "Both," replied Elizabeth archly, "for I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are each of us of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room, and be handed down to posterity with the lack of a proverb." "This is no striking resemblance of your own character, I am sure," said he. "How near it may be to mine, I cannot pretend to say. You think it a faithful portrait, undoubtedly." "I must not decide on my own performance." He made no answer, and they were again silent till they had gone down the dance, where he asked if she and her sisters did not often walk into Meryton. She answered in the affirmative, and, unable to resist the temptation, added, "When you met us the other day, we had just been forming a new acquaintance." The effect was immediate. A deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features, but he did not say a word, and Elizabeth, though blaming herself for her own weakness, could not go on. At length Darcy spoke, and in a constrained manner said, "Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as he may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain." He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship," replied Elizabeth with emphasis, "in a manner which he is likely to suffer from all his life." Darcy made no answer, and seemed desirous of changing the subject. At that moment Sir William Lucas appeared close to them, meaning to pass through the set to the other side of the room, but on perceiving Mr. Darcy, he stopped with a bow of superior courtesy to compliment him on his dancing and his partner. "I have been most gratified indeed, dear sir. Such very superior dancing is not often seen. It is evident that you belong in the first circles. Allow me to say, however, that your fair partner does not disgrace you, and that I must hope to have this pleasure often repeated, especially when a certain desirable event, my dear Eliza," glancing at her sister envyingly, "shall take place. What congratulations will then flow in! I appeal to Mr. Darcy, but let me not interrupt you, sir. No, you will not thank me for detaining you from the bewitching converse of that young lady, whose bright eyes are also upbraiding me. Ooh, the latter part of that address was scarcely heard by Mr. Darcy, but Sir William's allusion to his friend seemed to strike him forcibly, and his eyes were directed with very serious expression toward Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together. Recovering himself, however, shortly, he turned to his partner and said, "Sir William's interruption has made me forget what we were talking of." "I do not think we were speaking at all. Sir William could not have interrupted any two people in the room who had less to say for themselves. We have tried 2 or 3 subjects already without success. What are we to talk of next, I can't imagine." "What think you of books?" he said, smiling. "Books! Oh, no, I am sure we never read the same, or not with the same feelings." "I am sorry you think so, but that is not the case. There can at least be no want of subject. We may compare our different opinion." "No, I cannot talk of books in a ballroom. My head is always full of something else." "The present always occupies you in such scenes, does it?" "Yes, always," she replied, without knowing what she said, for her thoughts had wandered far from the subject, as soon afterwards appeared to her suddenly exclaiming, "I remember hearing you say once, Mr. Darcy, that you hardly ever forgave, and that your resentment once created was unappeasable. You are very cautious, I suppose, as to its being created." "I am," he said, with a firm voice. "And never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice?" "I hope not." "It is particularly incumbent on those who never change their opinion to be secure of judging properly at first." "May I ask to what these questions tend?" "Merely to the illustration of your character," said she, endeavouring to shake off her gravity. "I am trying to make it out." "And what is your success?" She shook her head. I do not get I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as to puzzle me exceedingly." "I can readily believe," answered he gravely, "that report may vary greatly with respect to me. I could wish, Miss Bennet, that you would not sketch my character at the present moment, as there is reason to fear that the performance would reflect no credit on either. But if I do not take your likeness now, I may never have another opportunity." "I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours," he coldly replied. She said no more, and they went down the other dance and parted in silence, on each side dissatisfied, though not to an equal degree, for in Darcy's breast there was a tolerable powerful feeling towards her, which soon procured her pardon and directed all his anger against another. They had not long separated when Miss Bingley came towards her, and with the expression of civil disdain thus accosted her. "So, Miss Eliza, I hear you are quite delighted with George Wickham. Your sister has been talking to me about him, and asking me thousands of questions. I find that the young man forgot to tell you, among his other communications, that he was the son of old Wickham, the late Mr. Darcy's steward. Let me recommend you, however, as a friend, not to give implicit confidence to all of his assertions, for as to Mr. Darcy using him ill, it is perfectly false, for on the contrary he has always been remarkably kind to him, though George Wickham has treated Mr. Darcy in the most infamous manner. I do not know the particulars, but I know very well that Mr. Darcy is not the least to blame, that he cannot bear to hear George Wickham mentioned, and that though my brother thought that he could not well avoid including him in the invitation to all the officers, he was exceedingly glad to find that he had taken himself out of the way. His coming into the country at all is a most insolent thing indeed, and I wonder how he could presume to do it. I do pity you, Miss Eliza, for the discovery of your favourite's guilt. But really, considering his descent, one could not expect much better." His guilt and his descent appear by your account to be the same," said Elizabeth angrily, "for I have heard you accuse him of nothing worse than being the son of Mr. Darcy's steward, and of that, I can assure you, he informed me himself." Ooh, noisy birds. I beg your pardon, replied Miss Bingley, turning away with a sneer. Excuse my interference. It was kindly meant. Insolent girl, said Elizabeth to herself. You are so much mistaken if you expect to influence me by such paltry attack as this. I see nothing in it but your own wilful ignorance and the malice of Mr. Darcy. She then sought out her eldest sister, who had undertaken to make inquiries on the same subject of Bingley. Jane met her with a smile of such sweet complacence and glow of such happy expression as sufficiently marked how well she was satisfied with the occurrences of the evening. Elizabeth instantly read her feelings, and at the moment of solicitude for Wickham, resented against his enemies, and everything else gave way before the hope of Jane's being in the fairest way for happiness. I want to know, said she, with a countenance no less smiling than her sister's, what have you learnt about Mr. Wickham? But perhaps you have been too pleasantly engaged to think of any third person, in which case you may be sure of my pardon. No, replied Jane, I had not forgotten him, but I have nothing satisfactory to tell you. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole of his history, and is quite ignorant of the circumstances which have principally offended Mr. Darcy. But he will vouchsafe for the good conduct, the probity, and the honour of his friend, and is perfectly convinced that Mr. Wickham has deserved much less attention from Mr. Darcy than he received. And I am sorry to say that by his account, as well as his sister's, Mr. Wickham is by no means a respectable young man. I am afraid he has been very imprudent, and has deserved to lose Mr. Darcy's regard. Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself? No, he has never saw him till the other morning at Meryton. Then the account of this is what he received from Mr. Darcy. I am perfectly satisfied, but what does he say of the living? He does not exactly recollect the circumstance, though he has heard of them from Mr. Darcy more than once, but he believes that it was left to him conditionally only. I have no doubt of Mr. Bingley's sincerity, said Elizabeth warmly, but you must excuse me not being convinced by his assurances only. Mr. Bingley's deference for his friend was a very able one, I dare say, and since he is unacquainted with several parts of the story, and has learnt the rest from the friend himself, I shall venture to think of both gentlemen as I did before. She then changed the discourse to one more gratifying to each, and on which there could be no difference of sentiment. Elizabeth listened with delight to the happy, though modest, hopes which Jane entertained of Bingley's regard, and said all in her power to heighten her confidence in it. On their being joined by Mr. Bingley himself, Elizabeth withdrew to Miss Lucas, to whose inquiry after the pleasantness of her last partner she had scarcely replied, before Mr. Collins came up to them and told her with great exultation that he had just been so fortunate as to make the most important discovery. I have found out, said he, by a singular accident, that there is now in the room a near relation to my patroness. I happened to overhear the gentleman himself mentioning to the young lady who does the honours to this house that the names of his cousin, Miss de Bourgh, and that of her mother, Lady Catherine. How wonderfully these sorts of things occur! Who would have thought that my meeting with, perhaps, a nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh in this assembly? Oh, I am most thankful that the discovery has been made in time for me to pay my respects to him, which I am now going to do, and I trust he will excuse me not having done it before. My total ignorance of the connection must plead my apology. You are not going to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy? Indeed I am. I shall entreat his pardon for not having done it earlier. I believe him to be Lady Catherine's nephew, and it will be in my power to assure him that her ladyship was quite well yesterday se'nnight. Elizabeth tried hard to dissuade him from such a scheme, assuring him that Mr. Darcy would consider his addressing him without introduction as an impertinent freedom, rather than a compliment to his aunt, that it was not in the least necessary there should be any notice on either side, and that if it were, it must belong to Mr. Darcy, the superior in consequence, to begin the acquaintance. Mr. Collins listened to her with a determined air, following his own inclination, when she ceased speaking, replied thus: "My dear Miss Elizabeth, I have the highest opinion in the world of your excellent judgment, and in all matters within the scope of your understanding. But permit me to say that there may be a wide difference between the established forms of ceremony among the laity, and those which regulate the clergy. Forgive me leave to observe that I consider the clerical office as equal in point of dignity with the highest rank in the kingdom. Provided that a proper humility of behaviour is in the same time maintained, you must therefore allow me to follow the dictates of my conscience on this occasion, which leads me to perform what I look on as a point of duty. Pardon me for neglecting to profit by your advice, which on every other subject shall be my constant guide. Though in the case before us, I consider myself more fitted by my education and habitual study to decide upon what is right, than on a young lady such as yourself." And after a low bow, he left her to attack Mr. Darcy, whose reception of his advances she eagerly watched, and whose astonishment at being so addressed was very evident. Her cousin prefaced his speech with a solemn bow, and though she could not hear a word of it, she felt as if hearing it all, and saw the motion of his lips, the words "apology, Hunsford, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh." It vexed her to see him expose himself to such a man. Mr. Darcy was eyeing him with unrestrained wonder, and when at last Mr. Collins allowed him time to speak, he replied with an air of distant civility. Mr. Collins, however, would not be discouraged from speaking again, and Mr. Darcy's contempt seemed abundantly increased with the length of his second speech, and at the end of it all he made only a slight bow, and moved another way. Mr. Collins then returned to Elizabeth. "I have no reason, I assure you," said he, to be dissatisfied with my reception. Mr. Darcy seemed most pleased with the attention. He answered me with the utmost civility, and even paid me the compliment of saying that he was so well convinced of Lady Catherine's discernment as to be certain she would never bestow a favour unworthily. It was really a very handsome thought. Upon the whole, I am much pleased with him." As Elizabeth had no longer any interest of her own to pursue, she turned her attention almost entirely to her sister and Mr. Bingley, and the train of agreeable reflections which her observation gave birth to made her perhaps almost as happy as Jane. She saw in her an idea settled in this very house in all felicity which marriage of true affection could bestow, and she felt capable of such circumstances of endeavouring even to like Mr. Bingley's two sisters. Her mother's thoughts, she saw plainly, were bent the same way, and she was determined not to venture near her, lest she might hear too much. When they sat down to supper, therefore, she considered it a most unlucky perverseness which placed them within one of each other, and was deeply vexed to find that her mother was talking to that one person, Lady Lucas, freely, openly, and of nothing else but her expectation that Jane would soon be married to Mr. Bingley. It was an animating subject, and Mrs. Bennet seemed incapable of fatigue while enumerating the advantages of the match. His being such a charming young man, and so rich, and living but 3 miles from them, was the first point of self-congratulation. And then it was such a comfort to think how fond the two sisters were of Jane, and to be certain that they must desire the connection as much as she could do. It was moreover such a promising thing for her younger daughters, as Jane marrying so greatly must throw them in the way of other rich men. And lastly, it was so pleasant at this time of her life to be able to consign her single daughters to the care of their sister, that she might not be obliged to go out into company more than she liked. It was necessary to make this circumstance a matter of pleasure, because on such occasions it is the etiquette, but no one was less likely than Mrs. Bennet to find comfort in staying at home for any period of her life. She concluded with many good wishes that Lady Lucas might soon be equally fortunate, though evidently and triumphantly believing that there was no chance of it. In vain did Elizabeth endeavour to check her rapidity of her mother's words, or to persuade her to describe her felicity in less audible whisper. For her to inexpressible vexation, she could perceive that the chief of it was being overheard by Mr. Darcy, who sat opposite to them, and her mother only scolded her for being so nonsensical. "What is Mr. Darcy to me, pray, that I should be afraid of him? I am sure we owe him no particular civility, as to oblige to say nothing that he may not like to hear." "For heaven's sake, madam, speak lower. What advantage can it be to you to offend Mr. Darcy? You have never recommended yourself to his friend by doing so." Nothing that she could say, however, had any influence. Her mother would talk of her views at the same intelligible tone. Elizabeth blushed and blushed again, with shame and vexation. She could not help frequently glancing her eye at Mr. Darcy, though every glance convinced her of what she dreaded, for though he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his attention was invariably fixed on her. The expression of his face changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. At length, however, Mrs. Bennet had no more to say, and Lady Lucas, who had been long yawning at the repetition of delights which she could have no likelihood of sharing, was left to the comforts of cold ham and chicken. Elizabeth now began to revive, but not long was the interval of tranquillity, for when supper was over, singing was talked of, and she had the mortification of seeing Mary, after very little entreaty, preparing to oblige the company. By many significant looks and silent entreaties did she endeavour to prevent such a proof of complaisance, but in vain. Mary would not understand them, and such an opportunity of exhibiting was delightful to her, and she began her song. Elizabeth's eyes were fixed on her with most painful sensations, and she watched her progress through several stanzas with an impatience which was very ill rewarded at their close. For Mary, on receiving amongst the thanks of the table the hint of hope that she might be prevailed on to favour them again, after a pause of half a dozen minutes, began another. Oh, thank you. Mary's powers were by no means fitted for such a display. Her voice was weak and her manners affected. Elizabeth was in agonies. She looked at Jane to see how she bore it, but Jane was very composedly talking to Bingley. She looked at his two sisters and saw them making signs of derision at each other. And at Darcy, who continued, however, impenetrably grave. She looked at her father to entreat his interference, lest Mary should be singing all night. He took the hint, and when Mary finished her second song, he said aloud, "That will do extremely well, child. You have delighted us long enough. Let the other young ladies have time to exhibit." Mary, though pretending not to hear, was somewhat disconcerted, and Elizabeth was sorry for her, and sorry for her father's speech, was afraid if her anxiety had done no good. Others of the party were applied to. "If," said Mr. Collins, "I were so fortunate as to be able to sing, I should have the great pleasure, I am sure, in obliging the company with an air. For I consider music as a very innocent diversion, and perfectly compatible with the profession of clergyman. I do not mean, however, to assert that we can be justified in devoting too much of our time to music, for there are certainly other things to be attended to. The rector of a parish has much to do. In the first place, he must make such arrangements for tithes as may be beneficial to himself, and not offensive to his patron. He must write his own sermons, and the time that remains will not be too much for his parish duties, and to the care and improvement of his dwelling, which he cannot be excused from making as comfortable as possible. And I do not think of light importance that he should be attentive and conciliatory in manners towards everybody, especially towards those to whom he owes his preferment. I cannot acquit him of that duty, nor could I think well of a man who should admit, on occasion of testifying his respect towards anybody connected with the family." And with a bow to Mr. Darcy, he concluded his speech, which had been spoken so loud as to be heard by half the room. Many started, many smiled, but no one looked more amused than Mr. Bennet himself, while his wife seriously commended Mr. Collins for having spoken so sensibly, and observed in half-whisper to Lady Lucas that he was a remarkably good, clever kind of young man. To Elizabeth it appeared that had her family made an agreement to expose themselves as much as they could during the evening, it would have been impossible for them to play their parts with more spirit or finer success. And happy did she think it for Bingley and his sisters that some of the exhibition had escaped his notice, and that his feelings were not of the sort to be much distressed by the folly he must have witnessed. That his two sisters and Mr. Darcy, however, should have had such an opportunity of ridiculing her relations was bad enough, and she could not determine whether the silent contempt of the gentlemen or the insolent smiles of the ladies were more intolerable. The rest of the evening brought little amusement. She was teased by Mr. Collins, who continued most perseveringly by her side, and though he could not prevail with her to dance with him again, put it out of her power to dance with others. In vain did she entreat him to stand up with somebody else, and offer to introduce him to any young lady in the room. He assured her that as to dancing he was perfectly indifferent to it, and that his chief object was the delicate intention to recommend himself to her, and that was therefore on the point of remaining close to her the whole evening. There was no arguing upon such a project. She owed the greatest relief to her friend Miss Lucas, who often joined them, and good-naturedly engaged Mr. Collins in conversation to herself. She was at least free from the offence of Mr. Darcy's further notice, though often standing within a very short distance of her, quite disengaged, he never came near enough to speak. She felt it to be a probable consequence of her allusion to Mr. Wickham, and rejoiced in it. The Longbourn party was the last of all the company to depart, and by manoeuvre of Mrs. Bennet had to wait for their carriages a quarter of an hour after everybody else was gone, which gave them time to see how heartily they were wished away by some of the family. Mrs. Hurst and her sister scarcely opened their mouths except to complain of fatigue, and were evidently impatient to have their house to themselves. They repulsed every attempt of Mrs. Bennet at conversation, and by doing so threw a languor over the whole party, which was little relieved by the long speeches of Mr. Collins, who was complimenting Mr. Bingley and his sisters on the elegance of their entertainment, and the hospitality and politeness which marked their behaviour to their guests. Darcy said nothing at all. Mr. Bennet, in equal silence, was enjoying the scene. Mr. Bingley and Jane were standing together a little distance from the rest, and talked only to each other. Elizabeth persevered as steadily a silence as either Mrs. Hurst or Miss Bingley, and even Lydia was too much fatigued to utter more than the occasional, "Lord, how tired I am!" accompanied by a violent yawn. When at length they arose to leave, Mrs. Bennet was most pressingly civil in her hopes of seeing the whole family soon at Longbourn, and addressing herself particularly to Mr. Bingley, to assure him how happy he would make them by eating a family dinner with them at any time, without the ceremony of formal invitation. Bingley was all grateful pleasure, and was readily engaged for taking the earliest opportunity of waiting on her after his return from London, whither he was obliged to go the next day for a short term. Mrs. Bennet was perfectly satisfied, and quitted the house under the delightful persuasion that, allowing for the necessary preparations and settlements, new carriages, and wedding clothes, she should undoubtedly see her daughter settled at Netherfield in the course of 3 or 4 months. Of having another daughter married to Mr. Collins, she thought with equal certainty, and with considerable, though not equal pleasure. Elizabeth was the least dear to her of all her children, and though the men and the match were quite good enough for her, the worth of each was eclipsed by Mr. Bingley and Netherfield. Yeah, I think my tongue gets stuck a bit. That is a long chapter. I'm doing my best. This is what live is. Sometimes you muddle through. All right, chapter 19. The next day opened a new scene at Longbourn. Mr. Collins made his declaration in form, having resolved to do it without loss of time, and as his leave of absence extended only to the following Saturday, and having no feelings of difference to make it distressing to himself even at the moment, he set about it in a very orderly manner, with all the observances which he supposed a regular part of the business. On finding Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth, and one of the younger girls together soon after breakfast, he addressed the mother in these words: "May I hope, madam, for your interest with your fair daughter Elizabeth, when I solicit for the honour of a private audience with her in the course of the morning?" Before Elizabeth had time to answer, with anything but a blush of surprise, Mrs. Bennet instantly answered, "Oh dear, yes. I am certainly. I am sure Lizzie will be very happy. I am sure she can have no objection. Come, Kitty, I want you upstairs." And gathering her work together, she hastened away, when Elizabeth called out, "Dear mamma, do not go. I beg you will not go. Mr. Collins must excuse me. He can have nothing to say to me that anybody need not hear." I am going away myself." "No, nonsense. No, nonsense, Lizzie. I desire you will stay where you are." And upon Elizabeth seeming really vexed and embarrassed looks and about to escape, she added, "Lizzie, I insist on you hearing Mr. Collins." Elizabeth would not oppose such injunction, and a moment's consideration making her also sensible that it would be wisest to give over as soon and as quietly as possible, she sat down again and tried to conceal by incessant employment of the feelings which were divided between distress and diversion. Mrs. Bennet and Kitty walked off, and as soon as they were gone, Mr. Collins began. "Believe me, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that your modesty, so far from doing you disservice, rather adds to your other perfections. You would have been no less amenable in my eyes had there not been this little unwillingness. But allow me to assure you that I have respected your mother's permission for this address. You can hardly doubt the purpose of my discourse. However your natural delicacy may lead you to dissemble, my attentions have been too marked to be mistaken. Almost as soon as I entered this house, I singled you out as the companion of my future life. Before I am run away with my feelings on the subject, perhaps it will be advisable for me to state the reasons for my marrying, and moreover for my coming into Hertfordshire with the design of selecting a wife, as I certainly did." The idea of Mr. Collins, with his solemn composure, being run away with his feelings, made Elizabeth so near laughing that she could not use the short pause he allowed in an attempt to stop him further, and he continued. "My reasons for marrying are, first, that I think it is a right thing for every clergyman in easy circumstances, like myself, to set the example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I am convinced that it will add greatly to my personal happiness. And thirdly, which perhaps I ought to have mentioned earlier, but that is the particular advice and recommendation of the very noble lady whom I have the honour of calling patroness. Twice she has condescended to give me her opinion, unasked too, on this subject, and it is but this very Saturday night before I left Hunsford, between our pools at Quadrille, when Mrs. Jenkinson was arranging Miss de Bourgh's footstool, that she said, 'Mr. Collins, you must marry. A clergyman like you must marry. Choose properly. Choose a gentlewoman for my sake, and for your own let her be an active, useful sort of person. Not brought up too high, but able to make some small income go a long way. This is my advice. Find such a woman as soon as you can, bring her to Hunsford, and I will visit her. Allow me by this way to observe, my fair cousin, that I do not reckon the notice and kindness of Lady Catherine de Bourgh as among the least of the advantages in my power to offer. You will find her manners beyond anything I can describe, and your wit and vivacity, I think, must be acceptable to her, especially when tempered with the silence and respect which her rank will inevitably excite.
Thus much for my general intention in favour of matrimony. It remains to be told why my views were directed at Longbourn instead of my own neighbourhood, where I assure you there were many amiable young women. But the fact that being as I am to inherit this estate after the death of your honoured father, who however may live many years longer, I could not satisfy myself without resolving to choose a wife from among his daughters, that the loss to them might be as little as possible when the melancholy event takes place, which, however, as I said, may not be for several years. This is my point. This has been my motive, my fair cousin, and I flatter myself that it will not sink me in your esteem. And now nothing remains for me but to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affection. To fortune, I am perfectly indifferent. I shall make no demand on that nature for your father, since I am well aware that it could not be complied with, and that 1,004% will be all that may be yours till your mother's decease. Is all that you may be entitled to. On that head, therefore, I shall be uniformly silent, and you may assure yourself that no ungenerous reproach shall ever pass my lips when we are married. It was absolutely necessary to interrupt him now. You are too hasty, sir, she cried. You forget that I have made no answer. Let me do so without further loss of time. Accept my thanks for the compliments you are paying me. I am very sensible of the honour of your proposals, but it would be impossible for me to do otherwise than decline them. Am I now to learn? I am not now to learn, replied Mr. Collins with a formal wave of his hand, that it is usual with young ladies to reject the advances of the man whom they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favour, and sometimes the refusal is repeated a second or even a third time. I am therefore by no means discouraged at what you have said, and I shall hope to lead you to the altar ere long. Upon my word, sir, cried Elizabeth, your hope is an extraordinary one upon my declaration. I do assure you that I am not one of those young ladies, if such ladies there are, who are so daring as to risk their happiness on the chance of being asked a second time. I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who could make you so. Nay, were your friend Lady Catherine to know me, I am persuaded she would find me in every respect ill qualified for the situation. Were it certain that Lady Catherine would think so, said Mr. Collins very gravely, I cannot imagine that her ladyship would disapprove at all of you. And you may be certain that when I have the honour of seeing her again, I shall speak in the highest terms of your modesty, economy, and other amiable qualifications. Indeed, Mr. Collins, all praise of me will be unnecessary. You must give me leave to judge for myself, and pay me the compliment of believing what I say. I wish you very happy and very rich, and by refusing your hand I do all in my power to prevent your being otherwise. In making me the offer, you have satisfied the delicacy of your feelings with regard to my family, and may take possession of Longbourn estate whenever it falls, without any self-reproach. This matter may be considered, therefore, as finally settled. And rising as she thus spoke, she would have quitted the room had not Mr. Collins thus addressed her. When I do myself the honour of speaking to you next on the subject, I shall hope to receive a more favourable answer than you have given me, though I am far from accusing you of cruelty at present, because I know that it is the established custom of your sex to reject a man on first application, and perhaps you have even now said as much to encourage my suit as would be consistent with a true delicacy of the female character. Really, Mr. Collins, cried Elizabeth with some warmth, you puzzle me exceedingly. If what I have hitherto said can appear to you as any form of encouragement, I know not how to express my refusal in such a way as may convince you of it being one. You must give me leave to flatter myself, my dear cousin, that your refusal of my address is merely words, of course. My reason for believing it is briefly these. It does not appear to me that my hand is so unworthy of your acceptance, or that the establishment I can offer would be any other than highly desirable. My situation in life, my connection with the family of Catherine of de Bourgh, and my relationship to your own are circumstances highly in my favour. And should you take it into further consideration that in spite of your manifold attractions, it is by no means certain that another offer of marriage may ever be made to you. Your portion is unhappily small, and it will in all likelihood undo the effects of your loveliness and amiable qualifications. As I must therefore conclude that you are not serious in your rejection of me, I shall choose to attribute it to your wish of increasing my love by suspense, according to the usual practice of elegant females. I do assure you, sir, that I have no pretensions whatsoever to that kind of elegance which consists in tormenting a respectable man. I would rather be paid the compliment of being believed sincere. I thank you again for the honour of your proposals, but to accept them would be absolutely impossible. My feelings in every respect forbid it. Can I speak plainer? Do not consider me now as an elegant female intending to plague you, but as a rational creature speaking the truth from her heart. You are uniformly charming, cried he, with an air of awkward gallantry, and I am persuaded that when sanctioned by the express authority of both of your excellent parents, my proposals will not fail of being acceptable. To such perseverance in wilful self-deception, Elizabeth would make no reply, and immediately and in silence withdrew. Determined if he persisted in considering her repeated refusals as flattering encouragement, to apply to her father, whose negative must be uttered in such a manner as must be decisive, and whose behaviour, at least, could not be mistaken for the affectation and coquetry of an elegant female. I've got another chapter, but I just need a second. Worse than talking to a wall, talking to a man. Okay, chapter 20. Mr. Collins was not left long to silent contemplation of his successful love, for Mrs. Bennet, having dawdled about in the vestibule to watch for the end of the conference, no sooner saw Elizabeth open the door and with quick step passed her towards the staircase than she entered the breakfast room and congratulated both him and herself in warm terms on the happy prospect of their nearer connection. Mr. and Mrs. Delusion. Mr. Collins received and returned these felicitations with equal pleasure, and thus proceeded to relate the particulars of their interview, with the result of which he trusted he had every reason to be satisfied, since the refusal which his cousin had steadfastly given him would naturally flow from her bashful modesty and the genuine delicacy of her character. This information, however, startled Mrs. Bennet. She would have been glad to be equally satisfied that her daughter had meant to encourage him by protesting against his proposals, but she dared not believe it, and could not help saying so. But depend upon it, Mr. Collins, she added, that Lizzie shall be brought to reason. I will speak to her, and about it myself directly. She is a very headstrong, foolish girl, and does not know her own interest, but I will make her know it. Pardon me for interrupting you, madam, said Mr. Collins, but if she is really headstrong and foolish, I know not whether she would altogether be a very desirable wife for a man in my situation, who naturally looks for happiness in the marriage state. If therefore she actually persists in rejecting my suit, perhaps it were better not to force her into accepting me, because if liable to such defects of temper, she could not contribute much to my felicity. Sir, you misunderstand me, said Mrs. Bennet, alarmed. Lizzie is only headstrong in such matters as these. In everything else she is a good-natured girl as ever lived. I will go directly to Mr. Bennet, and we shall very soon settle it with her, I am sure. She would not give him time to reply, but hurrying instantly to her husband, called out to him as she entered the library, "Oh, Mr. Bennet! You are wanted immediately, and we are all in uproar. You must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she vows she will not have him. And if you do not make haste, he will change his mind, and he will not have her." Mr. Bennet raised his eyes from his book as she entered, and fixed them on her face with such calm unconcern, which was not in the least altered by her communication. "I have not the pleasure of understanding you," said he, when she had finished her speech. "Of what are we talking?" "Of Mr. Collins and Lizzie. Lizzie declares she will not have Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins begins to say that he will not have Lizzie." "And what am I to do on the occasion? It seems a hopeless business." "Speak to Lizzie about it yourself. Tell her that you insist upon her marrying him." "Well, let her be called down. She shall hear my opinion." Mrs. Bennet rang the bell, and Miss Elizabeth was summoned to the library. "Come here, child," cried her father as she appeared. "I have sent for you on an affair of importance. I understand that Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage. Is this true?" Elizabeth replied it was. "Very well. And this offer of marriage you have refused?" "I have, sir." "Very well. We now come to the point. Your mother insists upon you accepting. Is that not so, Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes, or I will never see her again." "An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." Elizabeth could not but smile at such a conclusion of such a beginning, but Mrs. Bennet, who had persuaded herself that her husband regarded the affair as she wished, was excessively disappointed. "What do you mean, Mr. Bennet, by talking in this way? You promised me to insist upon her marrying him." "My dear," replied her husband, "I have 2 small favours to request. First, that you will allow me the free use of my understanding on the present occasion, and secondly, of my room. I shall be glad to have the library to myself as soon as I may." Not yet, however, in spite of her disappointment in her husband, did Mrs. Bennet give up the point. She talked to Elizabeth again and again, coaxed and threatened by turns. She endeavoured to secure Jane in her interest. But Jane was, with all possible mildness, declined interfering, and Elizabeth, sometimes with great real earnestness and sometimes with playful gaiety, replied to her attacks. Though her manner varied, however, her determination never did. Mr. Collins, meanwhile, was meditating in solitude on what had passed. He thought too well of himself to comprehend on what motives his cousin could refuse him, and though his pride was hurt, he suffered in no other way. His regard for her was quite imaginary, and the possibility of her deserving her mother's reproach prevented him from feeling any regret. While the family were in this confusion, Charlotte Lucas came to spend the day with them. She was met in the vestibule by Lydia, who, flying to her, cried in half a whisper, "I am glad you are here, for there is such fun here. What do you think has happened this morning? Mr. Collins has made an offer to Lizzie, and she will not have him." Charlotte had hardly time to answer before they were joined by Kitty, who came to tell the same news. And no sooner had they entered the breakfast-room, where Mrs. Bennet was alone, than she likewise began on the subject, calling on Miss Lucas for her compassion, and entreating her to persuade her friend Lizzie to comply with the wishes of all her family. "Pray do, my dear Miss Lucas," she added in a melancholy tone, "for nobody is on my side. Nobody takes part with me. I am cruelly used. Nobody feels for my poor nerves." Charlotte's reply was spared by the entrance of Jane and Elizabeth. "Ah, there she comes," continued Mrs. Bennet, "looking as unconcerned as may be, caring no more for us than if we were at York, provided she can have her own way. I tell you what, Miss Lizzie, if you take it in your head to go on refusing every offer of marriage in this way, you will never get a husband at all. And I am sure I do not know who is to maintain you when your father is dead. I shall not be able to keep you, and so I warn you, I have done with you from this very day. I told you in the library, you know, that I should never speak to you again, and you will find me as good as my word. I have no pleasure in talking to undutiful children. Not that I have much pleasure indeed in talking to anybody. People who suffer, as I do, from nervous complaints, can have no great inclination for talking. Nobody can tell what I suffer, but it is always so, and those who do not complain are never pitied." Her daughters listened in silence to this effusion, sensible that any attempt to reason with her or soothe her would only increase the irritation. She talked on, therefore, without interruption from any of them, until they were joined by Mr. Collins, who entered with an air more stately than usual, and on perceiving whom, she said to the girls, "Now I do insist upon it, all of you, that you hold your tongues, and let Mr. Collins have me have a little conversation together."
Elizabeth passed quietly out of the room. Jane and Kitty followed, and Lydia stood her ground, determined to hear all she could. And Charlotte, detained first by the civility of Mr. Collins, whose inquiries after herself and all her family were very minute, and taken by a little curiosity, satisfied herself with walking to the window and pretending not to hear. In a doleful voice, Mrs. Bennet thus began the projected conversation. "Oh, Mr. Collins!"
"My dear madam," replied he, "let us be for ever silent on this point. Far be it from me," he presently continued in a voice that marked his displeasure, "to resent the behaviour of your daughter. Resignation to the inevitable evils is the duty to us all, and the particular duty of a young man who has been so fortunate as I have been in early preferment. I trust I am resigned, perhaps not the less so for feeling the doubt of my positive happiness had my fair cousin honoured me with her hand. For I have always observed that resignation is never so perfect as when the blessing denied begins to lose somewhat of its value in our estimation. You will not, I hope, consider me as showing any disregard to your family, my dear madam, by thus withdrawing my pretensions to your daughter's favour, without having paid yourself and Mr. Bennet the compliment of requesting you to interpose your authority on my behalf. My conduct may, I fear, be objectionable in having accepted my dismission from your daughter's lips instead of your own, but we are all liable to error. I have certainly meant well through the whole affair. My object has been to secure an amiable companion for myself, and with due consideration for the advantage of all your family, and if my manner had been at all reprehensible, I beg leave to apologize."
There we shall leave them for today. My, don't we all want to be paid compliments like Mr. Collins? Actually, I really do love Austen's manner of writing there when she has Elizabeth say, like, pay me the compliment of seeing me as a rational creature and actually knowing my mind. There is, yeah, and there's a lot there. You can well imagine from a young woman who had to deal with men like that. Well, thank you for joining me, folks. There's more than usual today. I hope that was fun. And tomorrow we will proceed with, the next little bits, next 3 chapters. So I will see you tomorrow. Bye.